This is when Gideon and the 300, the Lord has whittled them down to 300 men. And they're going to go up against the Midianites in the power of God. And so that is where we're at. But the Lord is interesting because he still knows the hearts of those people who are on his side and fighting for him, are in ministry for him. So just kind of put yourself in this place here a little bit, if you will. Sometimes we're afraid to do the things that the Lord has given us to do. Sometimes we're overwhelming. In fact, if we can do it, we don't need God, right? In our life, we need God. So life is kind of that way.
So this is a really interesting part of the story to me. Gideon is afraid. He's going to take his servant and go down to the edge of the Midianite camp. Most of the times I've heard the story, this just gets glossed over. But this is actually the pinnacle of God's sign to Gideon that he can go down. And this is what kind of trips the trigger in him when he goes back to his camp. Says, all right, let's go. Everybody looks at the fleeces, and the signs, but this is it. This is it right here. God knows what we need for encouragement. He's going to provide it for Gideon. Gideon doesn't even ask for this. God gives it to him, and this is what he needed at the moment. I think this is so telling. So often we think we know what we need, right? And we're asking God, do this for us and do that for us, and show us this. And the reality is God knows all along what we need and has provided it. So this is a great part of the story in Judges 70, about verse 9.
So we're going to find out this is a very large group, that 300 now are going down against about 120, 130,000 Midianites. So that same night the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand. And how many times have we seen that in Exodus and Joshua and Judges now? So the Lord has given it into your hands. By the way, real quick, if the Lord has set something aside for you, if he's given it into your hand, it's yours to take, all right? And sometimes we don't really know what that is because maybe we're not close enough to the Lord. We don't really know what he wants for our lives. We're kind of guessing. But suffice it to say that if he has spoken something, it is a king's decree that thing has been given over to you, okay? And so when you know that you're supposed to be doing something in God, whether it's with your family at work or whatever it is, any kind of ministry in life, know that God is with you. Doesn't mean everything's going to go perfect. They're still afraid, okay? So just keep that in mind. So go down into the camp.
But if you're afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you'll hear what they say, and afterward your hands will be strengthened to go down against the camp. So he went down with Purah's servant to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. And the Midianites and Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance. And their camels were without number, as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance.
So the camels, remember, are to take the spoil. So they're there to rob and take and steal, all right? And
I thought they were there to kind of spit and bite at their owners.
Yeah, your camels are neck.
Yeah.
Why would he have him take Purah, his servant, as a witness? 2 or 3 witnesses. So now you've got this story, if you will, this event that has happened, and afterwards they'll talk to each other. They'll be with each other. Did you see what I see? Did you hear what I heard? Those kind of things. So that's biblical. 2 or 3 witnesses.
So when Gideon came, now he's come to the edge of the camp there with all those camels, right, and all those people. Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade. He said, behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread, like a loaf of bread, all right, tumbled into the camp of Midian, and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell, turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. So he got this dream of basically a loaf of bread tumbling down the hillside and hitting his camp and knocking it down.
Now, they're not Russians, so just because it says comrade doesn't mean they're Russians.
His comrade answered, this is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. Isn't that interesting how much the enemy knew? Now, this is always something that has fascinated me. I was talking to Pastor Raymond in his study about it. how much do the unsaved know?
Right.
We know they're going to stand before God and they're going to be judged. How much do they really know about God? I mean, how much do they really understand about him and about the coming judgment? You get little glimpses of this in the Bible, and you get some pretty profound statements as well, where God says in John 1, Jesus is the light who lights every man who comes into the world, and the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men. And you brought up Romans 1, right? Which was that they suppress they know the truth. They God says, I make sure they understand it, and they suppress it.
And so Peter says the same thing. Yeah.
It's just really interesting to me. So they go down to the camp here. They know it's Gideon. They know it is God, and they know they are defeated.
So remember Elisha? Elisha goes and he's causing problems in the enemy's king's camp, and the Lord is sending Elisha to take words to the enemies. But at some point, the king is saying, "Okay, who is doing this? Who is doing this?" And somebody says, "It's Elisha. Elisha is doing it. So go down and get him." And remember, they sent down tens of soldiers. I can't remember, a couple hundred, I think, a couple hundred soldiers. And the first time they go down and fire comes down. I can't remember what happened, but they die.
They're on the hillside and fire comes down from heaven.
Fire comes down and they kill. Yeah. Second group goes up, fire comes down and they kill them. What's the third group do? They come up and say, "Don't kill us.
Yeah.
We know that you're the prophet of God or whatever, but please come with us." So they know, and many of them are unafraid to die. At some point, they'll have to face that disaster of choice. Yeah.
But anyhow, it's a really interesting insight. And once Gideon kind of gets it, then he's ready to go.
Yeah.
Then he is ready to go. Do notice that he went down because he was afraid. And notice that theme throughout the book of Judges, right? Barak wouldn't go without Deborah because he was afraid, right? So there's this kind of fear thing all the way through there. And if you know, one of my themes about spiritual warfare is it is all about fear and courage, who God puts the fear into, who he puts the courage into. You see that in Deuteronomy. You see that throughout the Bible. That's one of his promises, they'll come at you from one direction and flee in seven, and that sort of thing. So the whole idea of fear and being given courage is a huge deal. God says you go down, you will be encouraged, if you go down and do this. And so he is.
It's interesting. They know even the father's name, Joash.
Yep.
Joash's name comes.
They know way more than you think they would know
Yeah, right.
down there in the valley. And I think when people stand before God, they have known way more than we thought they knew in their rebellion against God. And I've heard a lot of church leaders talk about that. I mean, remember R.C. Sproul talking about cosmic treason, that the idea of those who reject Christ, those sinners who will stand before him. It's not that they didn't know, it's that they did know, and they turned their back on him. And if you go through the Bible Project, one of the words for sin, which is often translated trespasses, means that. It means to stab someone in the back, to break a covenant, to be a traitor, if you will, a Judas.
Yeah. And that concept right there, we're going to find here. And then we're gonna follow that link through a couple other parts of the Bible, where the Lord is going to use that again. So there is no other. This is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God. So these people are saying God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. And so what are these men thinking in their hearts? They're going to die that night or that next day. It's very, very interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah. And Pastor Raymond's done a great job. I did not realize, we were talking this evening, how these things are going to be quoted again in the Psalms and in the prophets. This same account here has a lot of prophetic foreboding.
Yeah, right. So that's a good point. Just good to mention right now that if you're going through this, if I told you right now that I believe that this has prophetic foretelling here, then as we're reading and understanding history, will your mind click a little bit and go, okay, wow, okay, so I'm going to start looking for maybe little hints of that. And maybe we should just start doing that now.
Yep.
As soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped. And he returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand. It's interesting. The enemy said into Gideon's hand, and he says into your hand, all of Israel's hand. Of course, he's the God of Gideon, or of Israel. So
he didn't really respond this way with the fleeces,
No.
you know.
Yeah.
And now he's just ready. This has done something in his heart. This is really kind of
now he's talking like Joshua did.
Yeah, now he is. Now he has been encouraged.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Remember what he said at first? Rise up, a warrior. Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of the point. That's where he's rising up. Finally got it. Yeah. So he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, put trumpets into the hands of all of them, and empty jars with torches inside the jars. So you're telling me about how that can work.
Yeah, so the torches inside the jars, what you would do is you would light a torch, get it simmering, and then you would put it in the jar. It would dampen it out, okay? But it's still smoldering. So what happens if you take the lid off? Right, chimney effect, we call it the chimney effect. It, boof, it's going to take off. And so depending on what kind of fuel is on it, as soon as the air hits that, it's going to basically not blow up, but it's going to get very, very big and bright. So
the way my Old Testament survey professor told us is that probably had the trumpets in one hand, the torch with a jar on it in the other. As soon as they were given the commandment to blow, it was chunked with the pottery up with the torch and blow with the trumpet.
Yeah.
You just
yeah.
jump it down
so
and bring it up. And
yeah, so you have now 300 scattered across the
hillside,
Jezreel Valley hillside there. And so now you've got 300 torches that just, go like that. So, and then the trumpet's going at the same time. So is this the day of judgment kind of thing?
Yeah.
Right.
So he said to them, look at me, do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets on every side of all the camp and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. All right.
Right.
So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch. Now I always figured that was somewhere around midnight, right? First watch like 9 to midnight, the second watch midnight to 3, and 3 to 6. So somewhere about the middle of the night, in our brains anyway. And when they had just set the watch, so just at the change of the guard.
So there's confusion going on there.
Yeah.
Surprise, we should say. Yeah.
And they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets, broke the jars they had in their left hands, the torches, and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. It's great. Who was that had the sword of the Lord? Was that Jack Van Impe's sword of the Lord?
I don't know.
The old name. I mean, you get that old newspaper? We used to get it all the time. The sword. No? Nobody remembers that growing up? I'm too old. The sword of the Lord is the one that came out pretty rough. Maybe it's Jack Van Impe. Could be. Get him back there. Yeah, I think there's probably a stack of them. Yeah. Hey, Dad, do you remember who published the sword of the Lord? You used to get it. Sword of the Lord?
Oh, the Sword of the Lord, that was John R. Rice.
Oh, John R. Rice. Yeah, there we go. John R. Rice. Yeah, see, I knew he'd know. John R. Rice. Yeah. So go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. Then they blew the 300 trumpets. The Lord set every man's sword against his comrade, against all the army, and the army fled as far as Beth-shittah toward Zerirah, as far as the border of Abba Meheloah and Tabith. I'm not doing so good today.
Very good. No, that's perfect.
There we go.
I'm glad you get those.
You get these.
And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali. See, I got the easy ones.
Yeah.
And from Asher and from Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. So you got the 300 that caused this problem. Then they fled, and then the rest of Israel comes out.
Starts to come out.
Cleans it up. Yeah.
Come out of the hillsides, yeah.
Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites, and to capture the waters against them as far as Beth Barah and also the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters as far as Beth Barah and also the Jordan.
So my understanding, they're taking the water crossings where the enemy's going to be trying to go across.
Right.
And yep. Oh, here are the princes.
And they captured the two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. Remember those names.
Yes.
They killed Oreb at the rock. No, notice they didn't say, well, should we take them into camp and cut off their toes or do anything like? No, they killed them at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. Then they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon across the Jordan.
You made a good point, though. They killed these guys. They're going to kill the other kings, but they are going to torment the men of Israel who did not help them.
Yeah.
It is interesting. That is very, very, to me, that's an interesting part of this story. Right?
Now, so we'll just go into chapter 8 here.
So there's always some of this rivalry going on between the tribes.
Yeah.
You just see it all
And
throughout
it usually
Judges.
has to do with Ephraim and Manasseh and somebody else.
Then the men of Ephraim said to him, "What is it you have done to us, not to call us when you went against Midian?" They accused him fiercely. I think, isn't God the one who told him to get rid of some of those people? Yeah, they accused him fiercely. They were mad.
Take it up with God. And he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? God has given into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. What have I been able to do in comparison with you?" Then their anger against him subsided when he said this. What does Proverbs say? A kind word turns away wrath.
Yeah, grievous words stir up anger.
Now, Gideon could have taken it to him, said, hey, take it up with God, those kind of things. That's kind of what I want to say when I get in an argument, take it up with the Lord or, those kind of things. But he used honey instead of a bee's sting, if you will. Yeah. And Gideon came to Jordan and crossed over. He and the 300 men were with him, exhausted, yet pursuing. So he said to the men of Succoth, "Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." So remember those two names, Zebah and Zalmunna.
And the officials of Succoth said, "Are the hands of Zebah and Zuma already in your hand? Why should we give bread to your army?"
So what are they saying? You guys haven't won yet, so we're kind of concerned about these other guys.
So we're not going to help you out.
Yeah, we're not going to help you out. So
we're not going to help you out.
Not yet. Bring me the heads of these guys, yeah.
I think you can draw some parallels for this in the New Testament. The judgment for those who knew the truth but refused to stand is more severe than those who did not. Than those who were, and I think we're going to see that here, because these were the brothers of Israel. They should have been helping. They should have been on their side. So Gideon said, "Well then, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars." This is worse than it sounds.
Now, what's the difference between this situation and when he used honey just a couple verses before? What's the difference? The difference is that these people had a gripe against Gideon, and Gideon calmed it down. Here, Gideon needed bread. They needed help for their brothers, and they didn't come and help.
Yeah, Ephraim helped. They captured the guys, they executed them, they actually helped. And they were mad that they couldn't have done more. Here, they're not willing to help at all, even in the least little bit. And from there they went up to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered them as the men of Succoth had answered. In other words, we're not going to help you. He said to the men of Penuel, "When I come again in peace, I will break down this tower, or you can break more than that." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men, all who were left of the army of the people of the east. for there had been 120,000 men who drew the sword. That's not.
Yeah.
That's
So-
still way more than the 300 he had.
Yeah, so 120,000 have fallen, and there's 15,000 left, and they're not letting them get away. And Gideon went up by the way of the tent dwellers east of Nobah and Jogbeha and attacked the army, for the army felt secure. And Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna. I keep mentioning their names.
Their names are important.
Why do they keep mentioning their names? He threw all the army into a panic. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres. And he captured a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and he wrote down for him the officials of elders of Succoth, 77 men. And he came to the men of Succoth and said, Behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hands, that we should give your bread to your men who are exhausted? And he took the elders of the city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them taught the men of Succoth a lesson. Some commentaries want to say, well, you really can't make a case that he thrashed them. But I think you can make a very good case that he thrashed them. He taught them a lesson by thrashing them with thorns.
And everything I have read, that this is kind of a documented ancient torture technique,
Okay.
and it is not pretty. And it is not pretty. It is a bad deal. As a matter of fact, here in my MacArthur Study Bible, he writes in his notes, Gideon's threatened discipline of Succoth's leaders for refusing to help their brothers came due. He had them dragged under heavy weights over thorns and briars, which painfully tore their bodies. This was a cruel torture to which ancient captives were often subjected. Okay, so this, yeah.
So ancient captives, and these were supposed to be helpers, but they weren't.
So this is, this is kind of an ancient, documented. They were not always that nice back then to people. And in the New Testament, one of the scariest passages is in Hebrews 10, where it talks about those who have treated the blood of Christ as an unholy thing and have trampled under them the blood of the
It
covenant.
says how much worse for them.
How much worse for them.
Yeah.
How much worse for them. How much worse for these men of Israel who were traitors to their brothers than for the invaders who came against them.
That brings up a good point. Is there levels of punishment?
I think the Bible's
Well, the question
pretty
is there levels of reward? There's levels of reward, ask Paul, wood, hay, and stubble, diamonds, all those kinds of things.
Some saved as though by fire.
Yeah, right. Jesus said it would be better for them if this would happen.
Yeah.
And so there's different levels of rewards and different levels of punishment.
Yep. So he goes to Penuel. He broke down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. So Succoth, they were tortured. Here they are put to the sword, and their tower is broken down, which would have been the strength of the city. So the city becomes more of an open, defenseless type city.
Yeah. Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, Where are the men whom you killed at Tabor? They answered, As you are, so were they. Every one of them resembled the son of the king. And he said, They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had saved them alive, I would not kill you. So he said to Jethro, his firstborn, Rise and kill them. But the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a young man. Go ahead.
Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, Rise yourself and fall upon us, saying basically, if you're a man enough, for as the man is, so is his strength. And Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. You got a really interesting thing about crescents. I do want to point out here, though, about Gideon trying to get his son to kill these captives. And here seems to us to be kind of a cruel thing. I've been going through the Old Testament, and just getting through the Old Testament, my Bible reading now. God talks about teaching his people, to train their hands for war and raising them up. He even talks about the horses, being eager for battle in these things. And there's very much that kind of martial theme all the way through the Old Testament, that is, people should be ready. to stand up, ready to go to war. They should have their hands and arms should be strong to battle and that sort of thing. And a lot of people look to the New Testament and say now it's more pacifist in the New Testament. But the reality is the war's just gone up a level. Now we're in spiritual warfare. Now we're fighting against rulers and authorities in the spiritual realm, against these ideas and concepts that take people captive, the delusion, if you will, that is on it. So I think the warfare has indeed shifted to a spiritual realm, and I think our role in it obviously has changed as well. But the idea that we are to be encouraged and to strengthen ourselves against the wickedness that's going on, and to strengthen our hearts and our hands to deal with all of this madness, I think is still the same theme.
Yeah. Isaiah and Psalm call God, or Yah, a warrior. Psalm chapter 2 reveals that as well, and other places. So this is the difficulty of the Old Testament. I've talked to so many people who've been brought up in so many denominations that they haven't, they've gone through some of the Psalms, the lovely Psalms, and the sentiment of some of these texts, but they don't know how to handle the war. They don't know how to handle the carnage. And we can look at this in this book. We haven't seen anything yet. It's going to get worse. And we say, well, we'd rather, I'm not going to preach through Judges chapter 8 today because, I'm just going to lose some people. I'm going to turn people off. This is not our God. This is the God of the First Testament, not the Second. Those kinds of things. However, I want to remind you, remember when David was dying? What did he tell his son? Do not let their heads go down to the grave in peace. There's something that has to be done in war. So let's just use war as a concept. Now, you and I do not war against flesh and blood. So that's why we're not, carrying axes and riding horses and all those kind of things. We may at some point, and you'll have to make up that mind what that's going to look like for you. But back in the Old Testament, Israel was a picture of God's people, and they were literally at war with the flesh. But the war is in heaven, and the battle rages on, and we must be as fierce spiritually as they were physically. We need to be fierce. And the number one people, I'm talking about people now, the number one person that you need to be fierce against? It's honestly not the unbeliever. It's the false teacher. It's the false prophets. It's the people who claim to be brothers. Paul says don't even eat with them. So there's a system of rewards and punishments, but there's a system of who do I yoke my ox with? Not an unbeliever. But who don't I even eat with? That's a false teacher. And those who claim to be believers and walk differently. Okay? So keep those in mind, that we have to be as fierce spiritually as they were physically.
Yeah. Now you had some observations on these crescent ornaments.
Well, let me just take a little look here.
So remember, these are people from the east. So these are people from the desert. Talks about the tent people, the nomads.
Okay, I want to remind you, we've looked at this once before. You have Sarah and Isaac and Esau and Jacob. Esau marries into the Hagar line, okay? But then the Hagar and Keturah, they all intermarry. And then you got Sheba and Dedan and the Bedouins, okay? And really, they're all intermarrying. Okay, so that's the concept here. They really, if you carry it through, you can see all, if you study it real well, you'll see the intermarriage. Okay, now watch. Where do you see a crescent? So this crescent ornament was a picture of the moon god. Now, in 7:1, let's see, let me read that. then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, let Baal conquer, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Morah in the valley, which seems to be a place of sacrifice. The ornaments here, I think it was, let's see, I'm trying to get there. Let me just give you a couple pieces of
The ornaments are 21.
history here, yeah. For the Ishmaelites, the ornament was an alila, okay, an alila. In the Assyrian language, it was actually called sin, believe it or not. And both mean the moon god. Sennacherib, the book of Isaiah and Kings, means the sin has replaced the brothers. That's what it means. In other words, the moon god has replaced my brothers. In Arabia, it's Aliyah. Let's see, let me say this. Al-Ilah. And then, of course, out of this comes Allah, the moon god. The crescent moon. Now let me try to, I've talked to several people. Sammy Weber, who works with the Muslims over in Cameroon. You've listened to J.D. Farag. J.D. Farag makes a very good case. He has an Arab, his family's a Muslim black background. He says Allah means the moon god. Here's what happened. If you say Allah, if they say Allah in the Middle East, which they do, the word simply means God. Okay? So it's gonna be helpful for us to understand that when a Middle Eastern person uses the word Allah, they're simply speaking of God. So if you were to help them to become a Christian, they would have to learn who Jesus is. But in their language, they would still use Allah for God. That's where you and I have a problem, right? We want to say, wait a minute, you can't use that word. But that's their word for God. But it has morphed over the centuries from these other terms, from the Ishmaelites, Sennacherib, which is Assyria, and other places, Arabia. The word has morphed from the moon god to mean God in general. Okay? So J.D. Farag is correct that in reality, at the roots, they are talking, they have the name that has morphed from this moon god. So the crescent ornaments were hung, sometimes around their neck, but they were hung on the camels as protecting rights. And so that's what is happening here. That this goes way, way back to 14, 15, at least 1500 BC. That's what's happening here.
Maybe I missed something, but there's a crescent and a star that we're looking at.
Yeah.
And the crescent represents,
The moon god, the moon, but
okay,
we would suggest the moon god.
and the star then would represent stars in the heavens.
Right. As far as we know, as far as I know, I haven't looked into the star too much, but
That's figures in the history of these nations
yes,
represented by the flags on it.
right, right.
Sue had a
Sue?
question.
So Allah, am I understanding this right then? Allah is the small g God. Or can it mean the big G God?
Yeah, see, that's where we're at in today's time. That it is in the roots of it. It is the little g. It is a bad god. However, today's Arabs, Muslims, Middle Easterners, let's put it that way. Today's Middle Easterners don't have another name for God. They use Allah. So that's honestly the problem we're at, where if you were to translate and try to get somebody to believe in Jesus Christ, you would say, in the Arabic or whatever, you say, he is the son of Allah. Because they don't have another name for God. So that's the problem. And it's actually satanic how this came about. But that's where we're at.
Lots of interesting details that come out of this story.
Let's see. Is this where we're at?
Yeah, we just
Judges 8.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
got the ornaments off the necks of the camels.
Okay, right.
All right.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. The man of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And then he does something that's really interesting here. You want to take them through that? That's
And
really
Gideon said to
interesting.
them, "Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil." For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak. And see, by the way, they were Ishmaelites. That's a huge key. That's Saudi Arabia today, all right? And again, an intermixing of all these tribes. Verse 25, and they answered, "We will willingly give them." And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels. That's about 43 pounds. Besides the crescent ornaments. See, there it is again. And the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian. And besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city in Ophrah, and all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. So what was Gideon doing? Well, if you're talking to the commentaries, you know, you can come with up with all kinds of ideas. I honestly can't get behind the truth of why he did that.
There is a theme here in Judges, and we've touched on it before, and I think we're seeing it again, and we'll
Yes.
see it again and again,
Yeah.
is that they're always trying to come up with some kind of tribute or
Right.
monument to God other than what God established for himself, and it's always a problem.
Yeah.
The 2.5 tribes setting up that altar, you know, on their side of the Jordan, and people using...
The word ephod, how's that defined? E-P-H-O-D.
It's usually something that goes around the neck and it drapes over the breast.
Similar to a necklace?
Well, it could be bigger. It's like
Yeah.
a breastplate almost.
Breastplate
Yeah.
is the
Yeah.
word.
Hangs around the neck.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyhow, it's a big problem, I think, all the way through the book of Judges, and we even find at some point Moses' snake on a pole here,
yeah.
where people are just looking for other monuments, tributes
Yeah.
they initially set up to God other than what he ordained,
Yeah.
and every single time it causes a problem.
Now, let me give you my take on why he asked for this. We've mentioned this several times before, and by the way, this is going to play out in the future again. Isaiah 17, we will spoil those who spoil us. We will plunder those who plunder us. Plunder is the idea, so that these people are not going to get away with what they brought. So Gideon is saying, okay, give me your gold. How much is this worth to you? And so he's plundering them, which I don't think is a bad thing. The problem is he makes an ephod out of it. Why didn't he buy bread? Why didn't he scatter it? Why didn't he, take some, I'm going to take this.
Give it to
I'm
the
gonna buy
temple, the
food for my
tabernacle,
family. Well, yeah, give it to whatever.
the tabernacle.
But the point is that he made an ephod.
And again, an ephod is,
The breastplate. And that's the problem. That is the problem. And, you know, like you said, you know, they always went after these things that were made, the snake and those kinds of things.
So some practical application. Everybody hates the church, but the church is the one thing Jesus is doing in his kingdom. That's the one thing he says, I'm going to build. Everybody says, oh, yeah, I don't need to go to church. I can go worship God in the fields, hunting, or, you know, doing whatever I want to do. Well,
Now, the question,
that's not what God ordained, though.
question immediately pops into mind that the big idiots today are known as professional Christian businessmen.
Mm-hmm.
And they make a connection here some way. I'm trying to figure out just what it is.
Brave men, probably brave in the times we have, probably.
Mm-hmm.
I would guess. You might ask one of them.
Yeah.
There's one there. So Gideon was subdued before the people of Israel. They raised their heads no more, and the land had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Now, real briefly, we're going to get into some very interesting things, prophetic things next week concerning this chapter. But real briefly, I want to remind you of the devastation that happened so quickly on Israel because they rejected God again. And so now they've had a long rest. God gives them a good rest, and the devastation that happens there. Okay? So just keep that in mind as we continue to go through Judges. Any questions before we keep going?
Well, it's interesting. The name pops up here, Oprah.
Ophrah.
Yeah.
A little different.
A little different.
Name renowned today on
Yeah.
television.
Right. She preaches another God.
Yeah.
Anybody else have? Okay, let's close in prayer. Lord, we love you, and we're very grateful to know your word. It is difficult sometimes to see the depth of sin and the depth of war and judgment. But as my friend Pastor Mason has said several times, sin is deadly. Sin comes at a very, very great cost. And it cost you your son. So we're very grateful, Lord God, for your grace and your mercy, and we take it to heart, Lord God, that you deal with sin. Help us to deal with our sin. Judge ourselves, and we will not be judged. So help us do those things today, Lord. Just pour your favor out upon every heavy heart here tonight, Lord God, and take us forward into your grace and your mercy as we thank you and we praise you in Jesus' precious name.